They laughed in Berlin when America announced it would build 50,000 planes a year. They said the US was too slow, too weak, too soft to fight an industrial war. But they didn't understand what happens when America decides to wake up. The story of how America produced 100,000 planes while Germany laughed at the plan begins long before the factories thundered day and night. Because in the late 1930s, the United States was still crawling out of the Great Depression, its military tiny, its aircraft outdated, and its government unsure whether the nation even wanted to get involved in another world conflict. Yet in Europe, the fires of war were spreading fast, and German leaders openly mocked American industry as lazy, slow, and incapable of serious wartime production, believing that a country famous for refrigerators, cars, and washing machines could never pivot fast enough to build bombers and fighters in numbers that could match the Luftwaffe. And at first, even many Americans quietly agreed, because the aviation industry was small, scattered, and fighting for survival during the economic crash. But everything changed when President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a request so shocking that reporters thought they misheard him. He wanted America to build 50,000 planes a year, a number so outrageous that his own advisors whispered that it was impossible, ridiculous political theater. Yet Roosevelt was dead serious, and he believed something that Germany did not, that American factories were sleeping giants, capable of miracles when challenged, and that the same spirit that had built Ford's assembly lines and the giant steel plants of Pittsburgh could be turned into the greatest war machine on Earth. And so while German officers laughed in private memos about America's fantasy numbers, the United States quietly began transforming itself, pulling in automakers, appliance makers, engine builders, and tool companies, telling them that the future of democracy depended on their ability to mass-produce warplanes at a pace no country had ever attempted. And though many factory owners were nervous, they soon realized something powerful. America had three unstoppable advantages: raw materials, unlimited manpower, and a culture built around fast, efficient, high-volume production. And when these forces combined, the U.S. aviation industry exploded like nothing the world had ever seen, with plants doubling in size, new factories rising from empty fields, engineers redesigning airplanes to be easier and cheaper to build, and workers, men and women, signing up by the millions to run the machines, rivet the metal, assemble engines, and push every line faster and faster, until Germany's laughter slowly turned into confusion. And confusion turned into fear, because while they believed America would drown in its own ambition, the United States was doing the opposite, turning ambition into assembly lines, turning blueprints into bombers, and turning a once skeptical industry into a roaring giant that would soon produce aircraft so quickly that even American generals could barely believe the numbers coming off the line, setting the stage for the biggest industrial miracle of World War II. As Roosevelt's unbelievable goal of 50,000 planes a year echoed across the nation, the United States quietly shifted into a wartime production machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. And while Germany laughed, mocking America as a nation of refrigerators and radios, they failed to understand that this industrial culture was the very reason America could explode with manufacturing power on demand, because the American system was built on mass production, interchangeable parts, and giant assembly lines that were already pumping out cars, tractors, vacuum cleaners, and electrical appliances long before the war. And when the call came, those factories didn't need to be invented, they only needed to be converted. Detroit showed the world the first proof. Automobile plants that once produced sedans and coupes suddenly began stamping out wing sections, engine mounts, fuselage frames, and landing gear, and companies like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler demonstrated that American industry could take civilian production techniques and apply them to weapons at a scale no military planner in Europe had imagined. Ford's Willow Run plant became the shining symbol of this transformation. A colossal factory stretching almost a mile long, built in open farmland, designed to assemble a B-24 bomber using the same logic as a Model T, moving parts down an assembly line, simplifying components, and training thousands of workers, many with no previous aircraft experience, to perform precise steps again and again. Critics in Germany mocked the idea that amateurs could build complicated bombers, but the truth was that America's strength came from its ability to train ordinary people to operate highly organized production systems, And these people, farm boys, clerks, mothers, mechanics, and young women entering factories for the first time, brought an unstoppable energy that transformed American industry overnight. Behind it all was a financial engine Germany couldn't match. Washington poured billions of dollars into contracts, guaranteed purchases, and paid companies to expand factories before a single plane rolled off the line, meaning that risk was eliminated, innovation exploded, and American production chiefs had the freedom to experiment, redesign, reorganize, and build faster every week. As the country mobilized, German intelligence observed the increasing activity but believed America was too inexperienced and too slow to ever reach its absurd goals. Yet trainloads of steel, aluminum, rubber, fuel tanks, engines, and machine tools were already moving across the country day and night, building an industrial rhythm that would soon become thunder. And while Hitler's ministers boasted about quality over quantity, they did not understand that modern war demanded overwhelming scale. Fighter losses had to be replaced instantly, bombers needed constant supply, and spare parts had to flow at a pace faster than combat could destroy them. America understood this perfectly, and by mid-1942, the United States had begun producing aircraft at a rate Germany could not even dream of, proving that Roosevelt's laughable promise was slowly turning into a terrifying truth. As the American industrial surge gathered momentum, the country unlocked its greatest advantage, standardization, a concept so deeply rooted in American manufacturing that it became the backbone of the aircraft boom, because instead of building planes slowly by hand like Germany and Japan, the United States broke airplanes into thousands of smaller, easier-to-build components that could be produced in dozens of different factories across the nation. Then shipped to centralized assembly plants where they snapped together like an enormous mechanical puzzle. And this system, powered by millions of blue-collar workers, allowed America to stretch its production across hundreds of cities, meaning that no single bombing raid, no single shortage, and no single failure could slow the machine. America's vast geography turned into an industrial battlefield. Aluminum frames from Pittsburgh, engines from Pratt & Whitney in Connecticut, landing gear from Cleveland, plexiglass noses from California, radio systems from New Jersey, and machine guns from Massachusetts all raced across newly expanded rail lines, forming a national bloodstream of war material moving 24 hours a day. This network dwarfed anything Germany could build because the German economy, limited in oil, steel, aluminum, and labor, was already strained by its early victories and constant need to repair battle damage. Meanwhile, U.S. factories used conveyor belts, jigs, hydraulic tools, and mass production techniques borrowed from the auto industry, turning what was once a slow, complicated craft into a fast, repetitive science. Workers didn't need to be experts, they needed to be coordinated, and America excelled at coordination. Men and women, many who had never touched metal before, became specialists at a single task: drilling, riveting, welding, wiring, polishing, or sealing. And while Germany mocked this as mindless assembly line work, it was actually America's most powerful weapon because it meant that workers could be trained in days, not months, and production could scale with almost no limit. The U.S. also invested heavily in machine tools, giant mills, presses, and lathes that carved metal at speeds unimaginable in the 1930s, doubling, then tripling the number of machines in operation, giving every factory the ability to produce more with fewer skilled hands. At the same time, universities partnered with industry, rapidly developing new alloys, new welding methods, and new heat treatments that made planes lighter, faster, and easier to mass produce. Nowhere was this clearer than in the P-51 Mustang, a fighter that went from concept to combat-ready in a miracle of engineering speed, with design teams working around the clock and factories adjusting tooling on the fly to meet urgent demand. By the end of 1942, the rhythm of American production no longer depended on experience, it depended on momentum, and that momentum was becoming unstoppable. While German factories struggled under British bombing, material shortages, and bureaucratic infighting, America's industrial engine ran clean, coordinated, and fully fueled by a workforce united behind a single goal: build more airplanes than the enemy could ever shoot down. As 1943 approached, America's aircraft production pushed into a new and almost unbelievable phase because the factories were no longer simply building planes. They were multiplying their output month after month, creating what military leaders called the avalanche, a tidal wave of machines so large that even U.S. generals questioned whether the numbers were real. And this explosive growth was possible because the American government and private industry formed one of the most effective partnerships in history, tearing down bureaucratic walls, rewriting manufacturing rules, and giving companies unprecedented freedom to innovate. And the moment this partnership fully clicked, the results were staggering. Ford's Willow Run plant, once mocked by German intelligence as impossible, became a symbol of American industrial audacity, producing B-24 Liberators in a mile-long assembly line that looked more like a city than a factory, where raw aluminum sheets entered one end and fully armed bombers flew out the other. And although the plant struggled at first, facing misaligned tools, workforce inexperience, and mountains of flawed parts, engineers and supervisors refused to quit, attacking every problem with a relentless, almost obsessive determination until Willow Run began rolling out bombers at a pace that stunned the world, one B-24 every 63 minutes. Meanwhile, thousands of smaller plants across the country fed these giants by creating standardized parts with exact precision. Rivets, wheels, cables, panels, bolts, radios, gauges, hoses, and gun mounts, each manufactured to identical measurements so they could be installed anywhere by anyone. This level of precision meant planes could be assembled faster, maintained easier, shipped farther, and repaired quicker than anything the Axis could build. A German or Japanese plane might take months to fix after battle damage, while an American bomber could be patched up in hours with interchangeable parts that fit perfectly on the first try. Beyond the factories, America's training programs amplified this industrial miracle by creating millions of new workers, many of them women, who learned engineering tasks that experts once believed only skilled craftsmen could perform, and these ordinary citizens became the living gears of an industrial army that never slept. At the same time, Washington poured money into new machine tools, expanding steel and aluminum production, building new power plants, enlarging shipyards, and laying new rail lines to move material faster than ever before. This constant expansion created a chain reaction. More machines meant more parts meant more planes, and more planes meant more victory. Germany's leadership watched in disbelief as American factories outpaced them by margins that defied logic. 5-1, then 10-1, then 15-1, until German generals openly admitted that the United States had become the arsenal of the skies. And by mid-1943, the question was no longer whether America could hit the 100,000 plane dream, but whether the Axis could survive long enough to stop the machine that was already grinding its way toward victory. As the American production engine roared into the heart of World War II, the scale of aviation manufacturing reached a point where even the planners inside Washington struggled to keep track of the numbers, because the nation was no longer building planes as individual machines. It was building them as formations, waves, and fleets, turning the sky into a battlefield of mass that Germany and Japan could not match. And this happened because the United States mastered something far more powerful than raw output: logistical synchronization, the ability to make millions of moving pieces arrive at the right place at the right time. Boxcars loaded with engines, guns, tires, propellers, parachutes, seat frames, and navigation instruments rolled across the country day and night, feeding a network of factories that operated with a speed and precision the world had never seen. Even more impressive, entire aircraft were now being designed specifically for mass production rather than craftsmanship, meaning engineers simplified every system they could, reducing the number of bolts, merging components, straightening curves, and reshaping frames so they could be stamped, welded, or riveted in minutes instead of hours. The Army Air Forces demanded aircraft that could be built by the thousands and maintained by crews with limited experience, which pushed companies like Boeing, Douglas, Grumman, North American, and Lockheed into a new era of engineering discipline that emphasized efficiency over elegance. And as each company streamlined its designs, their factories became faster, their workers became more skilled, and their output surged in ways even they had not predicted. Behind the production miracle stood one of America's hidden strengths: its vast electrical power grid, which expanded at a breathtaking speed during the war, supplying factories with the energy needed for furnaces, presses, and assembly lines that operated 24 hours a day. Germany, plagued by fuel shortages and Allied bombing, simply couldn't keep its industrial lights on, while America opened new dams, coal plants, and transmission lines that gave its aircraft factories unlimited energy to feed the war machine. At the same time, a cultural shift swept across the country. Millions of Americans saw plane production as a patriotic duty, not just a job, and this emotional force created a workforce that worked weekends, added extra shifts, and refused to slow down even when exhausted. Posters, radio broadcasts, and newsreels constantly reminded citizens that every rivet, bolt, and sheet of aluminum mattered, because each one helped protect the soldiers overseas. And this national unity paid off. By late 1943, American factories were delivering planes so rapidly that Allied commanders changed their battle strategies simply because they knew replacements would always be available. In Europe, bomber losses that once terrified planners became manageable, because behind every destroyed aircraft was another one already rolling down a runway in Michigan, California, or Texas. Germany could not comprehend the scale of this momentum. Their factories were shrinking under pressure, while America's were doubling and redoubling in size, speed, and ambition. And by the end of the year, the question was no longer whether America could produce 100,000 planes. It was how quickly those 100,000 planes would turn the tide of World War II. By 1944, America's aircraft production had grown into such a massive force that it reshaped the entire direction of World War II, not just because of the sheer number of planes being built, but because of how those planes were used, supplied, repaired, and replaced with a smoothness that no other nation could match. And this advantage became one of the greatest strategic weapons the United States possessed. Every month, factories rolled out waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, C-47 transports, and dozens of other aircraft models, each one arriving with crates of spare parts, maintenance tools, and trained mechanics ready to keep them in the air. What shocked American commanders the most wasn't the success of a single airplane, it was the endless stream of replacements that never seemed to stop coming. If a bomber squadron flew a mission in Europe and lost 8 aircraft, they didn't collapse or fall apart because within weeks, sometimes days, fresh planes arrived straight from the United States, flown across the Atlantic to fill the empty spots on the airfield. It created a kind of battlefield rhythm Germany could never break. The Luftwaffe was bleeding skilled pilots, fuel, and aircraft they could not replace, while the U.S. Army Air Forces grew stronger with every passing month. Across England, American bomber bases expanded like small cities, with row after row of aircraft lined up on tarmac fields that stretched toward the horizon. Behind every runway stood mountains of tools, engines, spare wings, replacements for landing gear, and piles of ammunition crates stacked higher than men's heads. Germany had no way to counter a nation with this kind of industrial muscle behind it. And it wasn't just Europe. Across the Pacific, island-hopping operations depended on C-47 transports, P-38 recon planes, B-25 Mitchells, and heavy bombers like the B-29 Superfortress, all of which required constant replacements, fuel, and maintenance. America's ability to keep these planes flying in brutal environments, jungles, coral islands, volcanic runways, showed how deeply its industrial system reached into the battlefield itself. Engineers redesigned aircraft on the fly, improving cooling systems, strengthening landing gear, adding armor, increasing range, and solving problems faster than Japan or Germany could react. When U.S. generals asked for changes, American factories delivered them within months, something no other wartime nation managed at that scale. By this point, aircraft production wasn't just a statistic. It was a living, breathing force multiplier that gave American pilots confidence, gave commanders flexibility, and gave the entire military the ability to strike anywhere, anytime with overwhelming strength. And through all of this, Germany's mockery of Roosevelt's 100,000 plane plan had vanished. Their leaders weren't laughing anymore. They were watching their skies fill with Allied aircraft and realizing the truth. America had turned its promise into reality, and that reality was crushing the Axis war machine from above. As America entered the final phase of World War II, the overwhelming force of its aircraft production became impossible for even its own leaders to fully appreciate, because the numbers kept climbing so quickly that every month looked like a new record. What had started as an ambitious plan, laughed at by Germany and doubted by some American military planners, had turned into a nationwide manufacturing storm that dwarfed every Axis factory combined. At this stage of the war, American assembly lines were so synchronized that you could stand inside a plant in California, look down a line of riveters, welders, cranes, and stamping machines, and see an entire bomber taking shape like a mechanical organism growing in real time. Workers didn't slow down. They moved with muscle memory, speed, and a quiet confidence that came from knowing they were building the tools that would end the war. By 1945, America was producing aircraft faster than pilots could be trained to fly them, and that meant the sky was becoming a place where the United States dominated through sheer volume, range, and reliability. Germany's air defenses had collapsed under the weight of Allied bombing, leaving its factories, fuel supplies, and transportation networks crippled beyond repair. The Luftwaffe, once one of the world's most feared air forces, was reduced to a handful of desperate pilots and experimental aircraft that rarely left the ground for more than a few minutes. Meanwhile, America deployed new models, upgraded engines, increased bomb loads, and improved targeting equipment, creating a tide of innovation the Axis couldn't match. In the Pacific, American bombers struck deeper into Japanese territory than ever before, supported by long-range fighters, giant supply aircraft, and portable workshops that traveled from island to island. Engineers flew into captured airfields and immediately began modifying planes for local conditions, solving issues like humidity damage, coral abrasion on landing gear, and extreme engine wear in hot climates. Japan, already stretched thin and running low on steel, oil, aluminum, and qualified pilots, had no answer. American strength didn't come from any single aircraft, it came from an endless chain of supply that wrapped around the world like a steel backbone. Factories pushing out engines, railroads delivering raw materials, ports loading crates of spare parts, and convoys crossing oceans under the protection of American naval air power. The German leadership, once dismissive and arrogant about American capabilities, now faced a terrifying reality. The United States had built not just 100,000 planes, but the largest and most efficient aviation ecosystem in history. It was a force so large that even if thousands of aircraft were lost, destroyed, or damaged, the system kept replenishing them without strain. That was the moment the world realized the truth. America had transformed its industrial might into a weapon just as decisive as any bomb or battleship, and it had changed the outcome of the war long before the enemy understood what was happening. And as the Axis powers collapsed, one fact became undeniable. The plan Germany once laughed at had become the very reason they could no longer stand against the United States. By the time America reached the height of its wartime aircraft production, the country had turned its factories, towns, and transportation networks into a single, unified machine that operated with a rhythm unmatched anywhere in the world, and the rest of the globe watched, sometimes in disbelief, as the United States pushed industrial boundaries further than anyone had ever imagined. The secret wasn't luck, and it wasn't just resources. It was the combination of smart planning, engineering creativity, a motivated workforce, and a government willing to adapt on the fly. When a factory discovered a faster welding method, that technique spread nationwide within days. When an engine plant reduced breakdown rates by 30%, the entire industry copied it before the week ended. America wasn't just producing planes. It was learning while producing, improving while building, adjusting while fighting, and that gave the United States a momentum Germany couldn't slow down. German intelligence officers, stunned by the numbers they intercepted, often didn't believe the reports, assuming they were Allied propaganda. How could a single nation produce more aircraft in 1 year than Germany had built in the entire war? The answer became clear each time American B-17s, B-24s, and eventually B-29s filled the skies in massive formations, so dense they cast shadows on fields below. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, now struggled even to fuel its remaining fighters, and its pilots faced wave after wave of Allied bombers that never seemed to end. Even if the Germans shot down 50, 100 more took their place within days. That was the power of American industry. It erased losses with speed. On the home front, the psychological effect was equally powerful. Posters urged workers to do more, weld harder, rivet faster, conserve materials, and avoid mistakes, because every minute saved meant another aircraft reaching the front lines in time to protect soldiers, sailors, or civilians. Entire cities built around aviation saw their populations double or triple in size as thousands rushed to take jobs. Schools taught metallurgy basics to teenagers, while universities fast-tracked engineers to meet the demand. Women, immigrants, and retirees formed the backbone of the workforce, proving that American production wasn't limited to traditional labor demographics. When bomber crews overseas heard about the output back home, they couldn't even picture it. They just knew that no matter how tough their missions became, replacements would arrive, upgrades would arrive, and support crews never ran out of parts to keep their aircraft flying. That continuous, almost unstoppable supply line changed the psychology of war itself. America fought with the confidence of a nation that knew it could rebuild everything faster than the enemy could destroy anything. Germany, exhausted and collapsing under shortages, could only watch as its earlier mockery turned into fear. The joke Germany once made, laughing at America's plan to build 100,000 aircraft, had become a haunting reminder of how badly they underestimated a nation capable of turning industry into a weapon more powerful than any tank, rifle, or warship. And as the production lines kept rolling, the world understood that the United States had redefined what a wartime economy could accomplish. As 1944 pushed forward, America's aircraft production reached a level that felt almost unreal, even to the people creating it, because the numbers rolling off the assembly lines no longer represented machines. They represented the turning point of a global war, and every plane stamped, painted, and flown out of a factory was another nail in the coffin of the Axis powers. By this stage, the United States was producing aircraft not by the dozen or the hundred, but by the thousands every single month, and this staggering output created a chain reaction that reshaped the entire strategic landscape of World War II. The skies over Europe and the Pacific grew thick with American air power. P-51 Mustangs escorting bombers at incredible ranges, B-17s and B-24s carpet-bombing German industry day after day, and in the Pacific the arrival of the B-29 Superfortress, an engineering miracle that only a nation with the industrial strength of America could mass-produce, began a campaign that would push Japan to the breaking point. Germany, once certain that America's plan was impossible, now faced a nightmare where Allied aircraft replacement rates outpaced German losses by nearly 10 to 1, creating a scenario in which the Luftwaffe simply could not survive. Even if German pilots were skilled, even if their aircraft were excellent on paper, they faced an enemy with an endless reserve of fresh planes, fresh pilots, fresh fuel, and fresh resources. And behind every aircraft in the air was a deep, carefully constructed system on the ground. Repair depots that could rebuild wrecked planes in days, logistics units that delivered engines and parts halfway around the world, and training programs that turned young Americans into capable aviators at a speed no country had matched before. Meanwhile, Germany was stripped of its industrial heart piece by piece. Allied bombing raids, enabled by America's vast production, destroyed factories, fuel plants, transportation hubs, and steel foundries. With every strike, Germany's ability to replace lost aircraft shrank, and with it, their hopes of turning the air war around. In contrast, American manufacturers were still improving. Factories adopted new automation techniques, faster riveting systems, and assembly line redesigns that shaved hours from production time. By late 1944, bomber plants were delivering aircraft so quickly that some sat on runways waiting for crews to pick them up. This level of abundance didn't just support the war, it crushed the spirit of the enemy. German intelligence documents from the final months of the war reveal an astonishing shift. Their commanders no longer asked how to win, they asked how to slow the inevitable defeat. They knew that every time they shot down a bomber formation, America would replace it within days, sometimes within hours. It created a sense of hopelessness that spread from pilots to generals. America's aircraft production had become a psychological weapon, proving that victory belonged not just to armies on the battlefield, but to nations capable of sustaining war at a colossal scale. And while Germany had mocked America's ambitious goal years earlier, now they were living inside the consequences of their own disbelief. overwhelmed by a storm of American industry that grew stronger every day, driven by a nation that refused to slow down until the war was won. By the final months of World War II, America's achievement in aircraft production was no longer just a testament to industrial skill. It had become a decisive factor that shaped the very outcome of the conflict, a reality that Germany had refused to take seriously when the plan was first announced. By the summer of 1945, over 100,000 planes had been produced, each one a symbol of American determination, ingenuity, and relentless efficiency, and the enemy's earlier laughter had long turned to disbelief, panic, and despair. Every plane in the sky represented an overwhelming advantage. Long-range bombers capable of striking deep into enemy territory, nimble fighters that dominated the airspace above both Europe and the Pacific, and transport aircraft that enabled logistics and troop movements with unprecedented speed. Behind this massive production effort was a network of factories, assembly lines, engineers, and workers that operated with a precision that Germany could never match, fueled by a nation's full commitment to total war. The impact was as psychological as it was strategic. German pilots, commanders, and civilians alike realized that they could never replace the losses inflicted by American air power, and every engagement in the air became a battle against a tide that could not be turned. The story of America's aircraft production is more than just numbers. It is a story of vision, planning, and the ability of an industrial nation to mobilize every resource toward a single, clear goal. While Germany had mocked the idea of producing 100,000 planes as impossible, the reality of American factories, fueled by the efforts of women, men, and even teenagers across the country, proved that no industrial power in the world could match that scale and speed. By the end of the war, the Luftwaffe was broken, the Japanese air forces were destroyed, and the Allied dominance in the air was absolute, a direct result of America's unmatched production capacity. This achievement redefined modern warfare, showing that a nation's industrial strength could be as lethal as its soldiers, that the capacity to produce, replace, and innovate on a massive scale could tip the balance of global conflict, and that no army, no matter how experienced or skilled, could hope to survive against a nation that had committed every ounce of its resources to victory. America's 100,000 planes were more than steel, aluminum, and engines. They were symbols of determination, proof that foresight, planning, and relentless effort could overcome skepticism, mockery, and doubt, and a reminder to the world that industrial power, when combined with purpose, can change the course of history forever.